Luke today is joining us, who's the head of data and information for Freeths, and we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A on how law, I suppose, and how regulation is playing a part in keeping cybersecurity at bay in some respects. Where we left off in our conversation earlier was kind of what we were talking about with China, really, and how regulation and how data and how people treat data is almost a reflection of how we trade with each other in terms of the sentiment of how we feel. How do we feel about trading with America versus Russia right now? Pretty different. And online, and how do we feel about taking information from those places? Pretty differently. So my first question, Luke, is to what extent is that sentiment of how we treat data different with the different countries we trade with right now, and sort of what's happening there?
That's a great question. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody, for your time and the opportunity to speak to you all. So I think we can probably break it down into the different key countries, I think, and different relationships with them. And the sort of the legal data protection climate differs really at the moment according to our relationships with them, and I think the politics as well behind our relationships with them. So if I'm to take, for instance, where we are in the UK at the moment and our relationship with Europe. So previously, we incorporated the GDPR, the EU's GDPR, into our local law. And we ran with that for a number of years. And of course, Brexit occurred, of course. And we've now incorporated it as what we call UK GDPR. UK GDPR is very similar to the European version. And there's an important kind of balance or tightrope walk that we're doing at the moment in terms of our relationship, obviously, with Europe, but also in this particular area as well. Because on the one hand, there's a lot of talk around trying to pay a Brexit dividend to cut red tape for organisations in this country, to enable them to take advantage of a more, I suppose, liberal approach to data protection regulation than has been the case under GDPR and now the UK GDPR we've got. So we've got that on the one hand, but then we've also got a tension that we still very much get advantages about being closely aligned with the European model, the EU GDPR. And really one of the key aspect behind that in terms of the way we trade and the way we trust is that in GDPR, one of the things it regulates is the transfer of personal data outside of the European Union, or in this case ourselves, the UK as well. So there's a big issue as we were Brexiting around whether we would still enjoy frictionless data transfers from the EU to ourselves. I mean, right after the Brexit vote in 2016, the UK government immediately said, fine, frictionless transfers between the UK and the EU, we grant you that, no problem. Can we have the same in return? Assume so. Not so easy, actually. I think probably due to lots of different kind of political factors as part of that fraught Brexit negotiation we had. It took a long time for the EU to finally turn around and say at the last minute, in I think June last year, okay, yes, and by the way, you're adequate to receive EU personal data from ourselves as well. So at the moment, we're in but to our relief, I think, a good position where we can receive that data, if you like, trade that data with Europe to and from on a frictionless basis. But it's important to say that it's not an indefinite relationship we have with them on that basis. It's still tensions lie because there's a sunset aspect to it. So the EU, I think, granted it originally for 4 years, but they can then review that at the end of that 4 years. And then, of course, they're watching us very closely in terms of the extent to which we decide to reform our laws away from the EU system, from GDPR, to something which does pay that aforementioned Brexit dividend. And of course, the more you liberalise and the more you try to pay the dividend, the more you move away from the GDPR rules and therefore the adequacy that we currently enjoy. So I think that's a good example of our relationship with the EU and how it's expressed in that sense.
When you look at other countries, though, say China, for example, we had the incident of the Huawei, the Huawei incident with the government, where they stopped using Huawei equipment because they were thinking they would take that data from that equipment and sort of back into China. Do you think that all countries respect the GDPR principle?
Again, I think that's another very good question. I think GDPR was brought in, it was really kind of pretty much the first large-scale data law of its kind, with the principle, the idea that it would set a gold standard, not just for data protection regulation within the European Union, the 28 member states as was, but actually also by virtue of the EU being such a big marketplace, and obviously lots of businesses from around the world wanting to sell into there, it would actually also set a gold standard around the world as well, because one of the key aspects of it is its strong extraterritorial reach. So, if you want to sell goods and services into the EU, or now the UK, you've got to abide by GDPR. It captures you. I think that I am seeing signs of that working and that developing. I think, for instance, we see in America, which hitherto has had a very kind of sectoralized, I think, approach to data protection. We're seeing COPRA in California. And I think as regards China, is an interesting one because, obviously you wouldn't see it as a place where there's a lot of trust between the two of us, or between the West and China. A lot of mistrust, of course, and you've cited the Huawei example as a big version of that. But actually, one of the things we've seen recently is that China's passed its new privacy law, which is actually surprisingly has got a number of similarities with GDPR. So we've got this kind of twin track we see here. I think at the political level there's mistrust, but actually at Chinese sort of legal level, they are taking GDPR and running with some of the concepts in it. Indeed, we've been helping one of our clients who has a Chinese business, adapt his policies and processes to that new law locally with Chinese counsel.
To what extent do you think trust has diminished in brands because of digital channels and the way that brands treat customers and people digitally, especially in the light of a breach?
Yes, so I think a lot of the loss of trust probably occurred in the early days of digital transformation. I think if we go back to the mid-90s, where we had the EU directive, so the predecessor to GDPR, is a relatively high-level piece of legislation compared to what GDPR is. And I think that was reflective of, not just the level of sophistication, but also the level of, I suppose, aggression, if you like, of the way that businesses dealt with data and how much people really knew about it. I think then the level of aggressive use of data, as data became the new oil over the subsequent 20 years, was a key area that sort of eroded, or factor that eroded trust in not just individuals, but governments and each other and regulators and so forth. And so that really was heralded the GDPR's start. So I think a lot of that mistrust was around that period. I think it's interesting. I think there is increased levels certainly of consumer awareness, more than there was before, about individuals, about their data rights. So
is that because of GDPR, do you think?
That is because of GDPR. Now, if anybody can think back to around about the time that GDPR came in, how many times have you hit with a privacy notice and say, please review our privacy notice? And you probably was suddenly thought, what, this is the first time I've actually really thought about my data rights, etc. So it's an interesting kind of comparison. I think probably there's more trust to be had now that people are more aware, and now we've got stronger regulation than maybe there had been circa mid-90s to 2015 or certainly 2018. But also, because people are more educated, I think, about it, that also sparks off the synapses in their minds as to whether they can be trusting. We've seen things like the rise of the data activists as well. I don't know if anybody out there has heard of Maximilian Schrems. He's an Austrian data rights activist, and he brought not one but two seismic cases before the European Court of Justice around data transfers and how it's looked after, for instance, in the United States. And that's a big issue, therefore, for transfers out there. And so, again, it's the rise, I suppose, of the activist data subject, but the rise of the average consumer and person understanding their rights. So, in a way, as I say, probably more trust should be engendered because it's better regulated. But because people know so much more, people expect more. And they expect to be able to trust more, I think. And that's the key thing for me.
I'm going to bung two questions into one. So the first one is, we want to find out what organizations can do to maintain trust. But really, I think what, a lot of marketeers, for example, don't like all this regulation around privacy because it prevents them from marketing the ways in ways that they do. It makes it harder and puts blockers in the way. So can we expect more regulation as we get wiser to data, and as I say, what can organisations do to maintain that trust in that environment of if regulations are rising?
Well, yes, and I think that might well depend, differ sort of from country to country. So if we talk about things like you mentioned marketing, and direct marketing, we've got potentially a new e-privacy regulation that could be coming online at some point. We're still waiting for it to come out. It's taking its time. And that, in some respects, has a EU genesis, but it will be tightening up certain areas that will impinge, for instance, direct marketing. But as I alluded to before, the UK could well take a different approach actually to regulation, because we've got, we're bringing through in our Parliament, I think it's now at the second reading stage, our data reform bill. And part of the idea of the data reform bill is to remove some of the red tape. So if you use cookies in marketing, for instance, looking at ways of liberalising that, all the pop-ups, etc., and the consent mechanisms, simplifying that sort of thing. So I think it will it'd be interesting. It'd be sort of maybe an increasing patchwork of laws. I think probably in Europe, we'll probably see more regulation. I could see the AI Act, for instance, around artificial intelligence being another example. We've just seen the Digital Markets Act come out there. But then we've got these walled gardens, say, around the UK, where we might be going in the opposite direction. But again, subject to how we see our relationship with Europe going forward. It's such a fraught question.
Okay. Luke, I have no more questions. Is there anything you'd like to add to conclude?
I think the last thing I would really say is what businesses can do to engender trust and to sort of manage their business risk around data. And I just want to touch on something that was said actually in a great speech about culture as well. So the best organisations that I've worked closely with, and I was actually on secondment in-house as an interim head of data at a very well-known high street retailer, and they got it right in my view. A lot of the issues, say, around data breaches or infringements aren't so much about people actively doing, sort of consciously doing something wrong, but quite often it's just about people not being empowered to do the right thing. And actually, one aspect of trust for me is going out and training your business, building awareness amongst the people who work in your business, and then empowering them to actually do the right thing to help you comply. And that means that you've got to trust within yourself as part of your culture, a part of your compliance culture. But then that means to the outside world, to your consumers, your customers, to the regulators, to your business partners as well, because that's an increasingly regulated area, you are seen to be able to engender trust, and that's all the more important than it really ever has been.
Thank you, Luke. Round of applause, please.